p.m. agenda with Kieran Gilbert.
Hello and welcome to the program ahead of this week's opening of the 44th Parliament. And Prime Minister Tony Abbott sought to set the tone and the agenda with this video message posted on YouTube.
The Parliament is coming back, and I want to assure you that as far as the government is concerned, the adults are back in charge. That's what you expect, that's what you want, and that's what you deserve. You've already voted on the carbon tax, but now it's the Parliament's turn. This is my bill to reduce your bills. Abolishing the carbon tax will reduce the average household's cost of living by $550 a year.
Coming up a bit later in the program in about 40 minutes, my interview this morning with the manager of the opposition business in the Senate, the leader of the opposition in the Senate, Senator Penny Wong. I asked her about the decision here to oppose the repeal of the carbon tax and whether or not this will lead to ongoing political pain for the Labor Party.
I don't think he had a mandate for there to be no limit on pollution, and what we're saying is we're prepared to move to an emissions trading scheme which puts a limit on pollution. What we're not prepared to do is simply roll over because Tony Abbott wants the Labor Party to. I don't think anyone who voted for Labor people expects us to do anything other than fight for the right policy, which is to put a limit on pollution.
And with me on the program this morning, the Shadow Minister for Citizenship and Multiculturalism and the Assistant Shadow for Communications, Michelle Rowland from the Sky News Centre. Thanks for being there, Michelle Rowland. And here in the Canberra studio, Parliamentary Secretary to the Treasurer, Steve Ciobo. Steve Ciobo, first to you, the message from Tony Abbott, the adults are in charge. How much will rest on the performance of MPs, the behaviour of MPs in this Parliament to see whether or not that promise is met?
Well, I don't think it's that dissimilar to previous parliaments. I mean, the comment isn't directly per se about the behaviour of MPs. Obviously there's a high standard expected at all times, and we all know that. But what it's actually about is our approach to policy. It's about that we intend to be very different to Labor's approach. We saw so many examples from Labor cabinet ministers who would say that the Prime Minister would walk in and demand that there be a policy brief, 2 days later, and something being pushed through Parliament. Our approach is going to be very different to that. Our approach is going to be calm, it's going to be methodical, it's going to be purposeful, and that's what we talk about when we say about being the adults in the room.
But do you think it will be a different tone, though, given that
absolutely
the hung Parliament was the driver of it? Many say that the then opposition leader, now Prime Minister, drove much of it himself.
Kieran, Labor says they're always the victim of circumstance. It was a consequence of the Parliament being the way the Parliament was. I'm not going to say that wasn't a factor. But let's not discount that Labor had a very haphazard approach to how they were going about governing our nation, with sudden policy backflips. They'd introduced legislative changes that no one knew anything about, including, for example, cabinet ministers. So we are going to set a very different tone. We've attempted to do that already. We want to be calm and purposeful in terms of the way that we're going about governing Australia, and that's going to be our consistent, regular approach from this point forward.
Michelle Rowland, do you accept that there will be a different tone of this Parliament inherent in the fact that this is no longer a hung Parliament scenario?
Firstly, Kieran, can I put a call out to the many community members that I have in the Blacktown local government area who have Filipino background, and tell them that our thoughts and prayers are with them at this very sad time. I'd also like to say, in terms of your question about the Parliament, look, I don't think that there's any doubt that this will be a very different opposition to the one that Tony Abbott led in the last Parliament. For a start, this is an opposition that is going to be going in not just purely negative and not just with the intent of bringing down the government before the next election. And let's face it, that is what Tony Abbott's intent was every day of that Parliament. We have already demonstrated that even before Parliament goes back, we are a party of thinkers. We are a party of people who want to put forward strong policy, strong alternative policy. And we've seen that even in the last couple of weeks from many members of the Labor side, including people like Andrew Lee, who's been very forthright. I, for example, gave a speech last Friday to a very significant multicultural group where I laid out the methodologies and the priorities for Labor going forward in the portfolios that I'm responsible for. So we will be a very constructive opposition that goes to the next election with policies rather than with slogans. And as for
Michelle
the adults being...
Yeah, okay, I'll let you conclude your answer there on the on that particular message from Mr Abbott?
I was just going to say, in terms of the adults being in charge, well, they don't look like adults when Australia has to get its information about asylum seeker policy from the Jakarta Post, or we've got frenemies within the front bench of the government at the moment wishing that Barnaby Joyce did in fact resign over GrainCorp. So I don't call them adults at all, quite frankly.
I'll come back to Steve Ciobo on both of those matters, but I do want to ask you about something you touched on in your first answer, and I should follow up on, of course, the awful typhoon that hit the Philippines. There's been some criticism about the government's level of support on this. What do you say about the amount that's been offered by the government? Is it appropriate?
Look, I think that Australia should do everything it can. As to the quantum, I have seen reports that it is not, some people criticising it as not being sufficient. Look, I would hope that in times like this it doesn't become and I don't want to politicise it at all. And we've even seen other regional issues, other regional crises, that natural disasters that happened during the last Parliament, where initially a certain amount was pledged and then that was increased. Look, I hope that there is bipartisan support for Australia to do as much as it can, because this is about people's lives and rebuilding.
I have no doubt there's bipartisan support in expressing our condolences right across the board to the people of the Philippines.
I mean, that is the case, Kieran, and on these issues of natural disasters, you know, as tragic as they all are, and they all are tragic. I mean, we see now, you know, expected up to 10,000 fatalities. I mean, it's truly horrific, and of course condolences. But across the parliamentary aisle from both sides of the chamber, we join together, we're bipartisan on these issues, and we'll provide whatever support that we possibly can. That's absolutely the case.
Indeed. Let's move on now. I want to just tap into a little bit more of what Tony Abbott said in that video message, particularly on the carbon tax. And it sounded a lot like the message, in fact the whole video message sounded a lot like the arguments and the message of Mr Abbott before the election as well.
Well, look, guilty of being consistent. I mean, we're guilty of saying to the Australian people, this is what we're going to do if you elect us, and now we're going to follow through on that. We made it clear that from our perspective, the last election was essentially a referendum on the carbon tax. We've got a clear mandate from the Australian people to repeal the world's biggest carbon tax, and that is our first order of business this week. It's a new parliament. We're looking forward to getting stuck into it. We've got a heavy workload ahead of us, and one of the first things, well, not one of the first thing we're going to do is to remove the world's biggest carbon tax. Only Labor needs to decide where they stand on this. It's only the Labor Party that stands between Australians having lower electricity prices and a lower cost of living versus digging their heels and ignoring the wishes of the Australian people and saying, we don't care what Australians voted for, we're going to stand by our arrangement with the Greens, and we're going to continue to have the same policy that we used to have.
And you can't really argue with the consistency of message, Michelle Rowland, and the fact that Mr Abbott had argued for this and promised that this would be the first legislation that they would put to the Parliament day in, day out in the lead up to the election. I'll put the same question to you that I put to Senator Wong a bit earlier. Are you worried about the political flack that Labor will cop over the coming months by taking this stance?
Look, well, firstly, I'll say in terms of that video, that video didn't go far enough. It should have had a bit of a cut from when Tony Abbott said, if we're going to deal with climate change, we should have a simple tax. It should have had that in it as well. So, you know, talking about consistency, what a load of rubbish. What a load of rubbish. This was a party who went to the 2007 and 2010 election promising to put a price on carbon. So I have no doubt that we are on the right side of history. This is the right policy. I still haven't found someone on the coalition side who can explain direct action. It's a friendless policy. You can't find any reputable economists or environmentalists who support it. And it's no wonder then that they are looking forward to going into the Parliament. Well, I certainly am going forward to look to the Parliament, being able to debate markets versus subsidising polluters. I'm very happy to do that because we're on the right side of history. We're on the right side of science. We've seen a war on science from this government, cutting the CSIRO, just ignoring all the facts on climate change. So I'm very happy to go into the Parliament and debate that I support markets. I support a market-based mechanism to dealing with climate change, which is scientifically proven.
But hasn't Labor suffered because you've got well ahead of the rest of the world? Now, on the international climate talks underway this week in Warsaw, the government isn't sending a minister, they've got an ambassador there doing the job. They argue now, the Australian newspaper reports this morning, that the government will be in the mainstream of international negotiations and won't sign on to a post-2015 deal, Michelle Rowland, unless other major economies do the same. Now, isn't that a fair benchmark? And as I say, didn't Labor suffer because you were so far ahead of the rest of the world?
Well, look, I don't accept that for a minute. I mean, we have seen countries around the world, some of the biggest economies in the world, putting price on carbon. And I don't think that Australia should be the one to actually go in and say, oh, we're going to use something that's not a market-based mechanism. In fact, you won't find anyone around the world who supports what the coalition is proposing. And I'll also say this, when you talk about political flack, the fact is we went to the 2010 election with a promise, with a commitment to bring forward the end of the fixed price on carbon by 1 year. We actually abolished the carbon tax as part of our policy. But the question then becomes, what do you want to replace it with? Do you want to replace it with subsidising polluters or a market-based mechanism? And I believe in
Steve
markets.
Ciobo, I want to ask you about the international climate talks because you don't have a minister there. It sounds like the government isn't giving your officials there any power to sign on to anything that will cost the government any money. So have you given up on these UN talks?
We have Australia's climate change ambassador at these discussions. So let me reject completely this notion from Labor that we're not interested in making the world and the environment a better place, that we're not interested in forward-looking policy. We are. We have a climate change ambassador. For goodness sake, this person's core job is to deal with exactly these kinds of international arrangements.
But no power to agree to anything if you don't have a minister
because ultimately it's got to be decided by the Parliament, right? So let's have an appropriate person who in this case is the climate change ambassador, taking part in the talks, developing up what agreements there may be that flow from it, and then we'll look at those agreements. That is the appropriate course of action to do, and it's entirely consistent with what countries do all around the world. But the point I'd make is this, Kieran. You know, I've been sitting here listening now to Michelle talk about how they want to be a new positive Labor Party and how the Labor Party wants to be positive and not just be obstructionist. But all I've heard from Labor in response to us as a new government is negativity about climate change, how they're going to support the world's biggest carbon tax, how they want that to stay in place, negativity about what's happening with border protection, negativity about climate change. So, you know, I think it's a classic example of Labor saying one thing but doing another.
On the government's position on the UN international climate talks, has there not been any backsliding here at all in terms of Australia's commitment to these talks? As I say, the first time since the 90s that we don't have a minister there.
Sure. Well,
and you're not going to agree to another round unless every major economy signs on.
I'll tell you what we're not going to do. We're not going to do what Kevin Rudd and the Labor Party did when they took an entourage of something like 300 or 350 people across to the Copenhagen talks, so that Australia actually, I think, had the single biggest delegation or entourage there at an obscene cost, millions and millions of dollars, for naught for the Australian people, and only did one thing, which was run up Australia's debt and deficit. So what we're going to do is we're going to do it appropriately. We've got our climate change ambassador there. He'll be participating in the discussions. Anything concrete that flows from that, we'll have a look at.
Do you see this as Australia going from leading the world to now in the mainstream, or are we in fact now at the back of the pack when it comes to dealing
Kieran,
with it?
the last thing you would do as a responsible government to the Australian people is put a tax on our industries that give us a competitive advantage, just so that you can say, well, look, aren't we the great guys globally? We're the ones who are saving the planet. It's rubbish. The reality is that Australia is such a minute contributor to global CO2 emissions that what we need to do is work in lockstep with our competitor nations. If we don't move in lockstep with competitor nations, then the reality is that we will lose jobs, we'll lose investment, and that's going to mean a detrimental impact on Australian standard of living.
We're going to take a quick break on AM Agenda. Stay with us, we'll be right back. This is AM Agenda, and with me this morning, the Parliamentary Secretary to the Treasurer, Steve Ciobo, here in Canberra. And in the Sky News Centre, we've got the Shadow Minister for Citizenship and Multiculturalism, Michelle Rowland. On the issue of border protection and the boats, Steve Ciobo, we've seen some conflicting numbers from the government, from Scott Morrison at the weekend saying that 2 boats had been rejected by Indonesia, saying they wouldn't accept the return of asylum seekers to Indonesia. That was what Scott Morrison said. The Indonesian officials quoted in the Jakarta Post saying it was 3 vessels, and in the last couple of months, every boat had been rejected. Is this a bad look given the different numbers put and the different messages made?
Kieran, I think in terms of the Australian public, the only numbers they care about is what's happening with the number of arrivals. And we know that the number of boat arrivals under the coalition is down 75%. So that's the only number that matters. A decrease of 75% of those that are coming here seeking asylum. The reality is this, Kieran. We know that we had a complete schmozzle under Labor. We know that we had 50,000 people that arrived by boat. Unfortunately and tragically, 1,000 lives lost at sea, and it was costing Australians around $12 billion. The coalition has now brought that down by 75%, and we will, over time, I'm very confident, completely stop the boats. We have a new approach to doing it. We're not going to outsource our immigration policy to people smugglers. We're not going to provide a constant supply of information that they can then market their product out there. We're accountable. We're providing weekly updates, but most importantly, the runs are on the scoreboard, and that is that we are seeing a massive decline in the number of illegal boat arrivals.
And Michelle Rowland, doesn't the coalition government deserve credit for that? I know you'll say that the decline started under Labor, but it continued and improved even further in recent weeks under the coalition Abbott government.
Well, I am going to say that, and I'm also going to say this. I'd like to know where their turning back the boats policy has actually worked. They're supposed to be turning back boats. They're supposed to be buying boats. They're supposed to have this heaps better relationship with Indonesia than Labor had. I've been lectured how many times in interviews, in debates with members of the government about Australia's relationship with Indonesia when Labor was in government, saying that they could do it so much better than we could. This has gone, as Richard Marles has said, this has gone from embarrassing to farcical. We have a situation where this government is enjoying.
Is she being all positive again?
Listen, you'll learn something. You'll learn something because you seem to have forgotten. You've seemed to have forgotten, Steve, that your last answer was basically the diatribe that you were giving 6 months ago. Exact diatribe you were giving 6 months ago because of two reasons. Firstly, you can't defend the fact that Scott Morrison has gone from being, as the Herald described this morning, this omnipresent force and all of a sudden become this little indignant kitten. And secondly, that this is implementing the policies that Labor had since July this year. Implementing Labor's policy since July. Now, these people were very happy to stand in front of billboards saying how many boats have arrived. Now they're hiding the boats. They wanted to stop the boats. Now they want to hide the boats.
Well,
what boats have they bought? I don't know.
Let's put to you about Scott Morrison, the media management. He's doing the weekly update. You say it's accountable, but will he have to gradually increase that to be truly accountable and transparent?
You know, Kieran, what we're going to do is we're going to work to the advice that's being provided to us from those that are in charge of Operation Sovereign Borders. We know that this constant supply of information was a marketing tool for the people smugglers. We know that every time Labor put out a press release, and let's be frank, they were doing it on a daily basis with the number of boats that were coming under Labor. That was an opportunity for the people smugglers to say, look, another one of our boats have arrived in Australia, come aboard, come aboard. We've stopped that flow.
With the help of the opposition.
Well, we've stopped that
trumpeting every arrival as well.
I mean, you know, seriously, it wasn't the opposition that caused this problem. It was a consequence of Labor policy. But you know what? I want to put that behind us in the sense that we are a new government, we've got a new approach, we have complete resolve and determination to make a difference here. And importantly, Kieran, we are making a difference. It's down 75%. So Michelle can get hysterical.
To you.
Michelle can get as upset as she wants to. But the reality is that we are delivering a 75% reduction in the number of boats. We'll turn them around where it's safe to do so. We'll provide temporary protection visas and we'll shut people offshore.
Let's move on. GrainCorp. Barnaby Joyce has apparently told colleagues that his position would be untenable if Joe Hockey, your boss in Treasury, if he does approve the GrainCorp sale on December the 17th when that decision is to be made. Enormous tensions within the coalition already on this, and the joint party room hasn't even met yet. You're meeting today for the first time.
Well, we are having a joint party room this afternoon, and we'll no doubt go through all the things that we want to discuss as a joint party room about the forthcoming Parliament. We've got a big workload ahead of us. We've got to, restore the budget back to balance. We've got to pay down Labor's debt. We've got to scrap the carbon tax. So we've got a lot to do.
You've got to rein in the Nationals as well on GrainCorp.
Well, no, I mean, the Treasurer will look at this, and look, I have no problem with different people putting forward their different points of view. The reality is that this is a contentious issue. We understand that there are people on all sides of the fence who want to have their say about what is the appropriate way forward here. From my perspective, the Treasurer's made it clear he'll make a determination in due course, so we'll wait until that determination is made.
But did you Do you concede that some of your colleagues feel that the Nationals are trying to bully Mr Hockey?
Look, I've got no doubt that there are people who have strong views. I mean, that's apparent. I don't think that it's bad to have strong views in politics. In fact, I think politicians having strong views about what they think is in the national interest is exactly what we're paid to do.
What if the Nationals start quitting over this issue?
You know, Kieran, let's not get ahead of ourselves. People are reflecting their strong views and in some cases views of their constituency. Clearly there's an argument from those who say we want foreign investment, it's good for Aussie jobs, and then there's the argument from those who say, look, we're concerned about this particular deal and we don't think it's in the national interest. Ultimately, the man who's paid the big bucks to work this out is the Treasurer. The Treasurer will have a look at this, he'll determine what's in the national interest and his decision will be made.
Michelle Rowland, we're almost out of time, but that is the fact, isn't it, that Joe Hockey has said repeatedly he will make this decision based on the national interest, despite Labor and others trying to, well, capitalise on this divide within the coalition.
Well, he even said on Friday in a speech that he wants more foreign investment. Make the decision. Make the decision. Look, this is one in which the coalition are hopelessly divided. And let's make no bones about it. Let's make no bones about it. And these are the same people
being positive
who voted.
again, Michelle?
These are the same people.
Is this you being positive again?
I positively want to see us investment in Australia. As for you, my friend, you can't even support what the Liberal Party is supposed to stand for, which is free markets. Go figure.
All right, Michelle Rowland, Steve Ciobo, thanks for that.
Thank you.
Have a good week. First week of the 44th Parliament. Thank you.